In 1958, every new chemical added to American food had to be proven safe before it reached a single shelf. Today, for nearly a third of the 10,000 chemicals in our food supply, no federal scientist has ever checked it all. Not because the law was repealed, because somewhere along the way companies were quietly allowed to decide, on their own, what counts as safe, and never tell anyone. Rewind to the early 1950s. A New York congressman named James Delaney led a congressional investigation after growing public concern that American food was steadily filling up with untested chemicals. His committee examined more than 8,000 substances already in use and found that barely half of them were considered genuinely safe by the scientists reviewing them. The rest were largely unstudied, added to food with no one ever checking. That investigation led directly to the Food Additives Amendment of 1958, signed into law by President Eisenhower.
Protecting the American public and our food supply. It will modernize our food safety system for the first time in over 70 years. It's not since the Great Depression that we've had significant reforms, and this will help prevent foodborne illness before it occurs. It will ensure that food companies are taking every step that they can to prevent contamination.
For the first time in American history, any brand new chemical added to food had to be tested and formally approved by the FDA before it could reach a single shelf. Full stop. But lawmakers built in one deliberate exception. And at the time, it made sense. Ingredients that had already been used safely for generations, vinegar, salt, baking soda, black pepper, didn't need to go through that same testing gauntlet. Scientists already agreed they were safe. This was called being generally recognized as safe, GRAS for short. It was designed as a narrow, common-sense shortcut for the obvious cases, not a separate lane around the law for anything new. That single exception is where this entire story actually begins. In a kitchen not so different from millions of others that decade, a young mother we'll call Ruth kept a pantry with maybe 24 ingredients on the shelf. Flour, sugar, lard, baking soda, every one of them she could read out loud without pausing, and every one of them had been on American tables for generations already. There was nothing on that shelf she couldn't trace back to her own mother's kitchen. Hand her a label from a store shelf today, and she likely wouldn't recognize half of what was printed on it, not because she was uneducated, but because most of it simply didn't exist yet. If you'd stood in that same kitchen in 1958, you'd have recognized everything on that shelf too. That was the deal Congress struck in 1958. Test the new, trust the old. That was then. So, when did that promise start to change? But here's what nobody in that hearing room in 1958 could have predicted. The same narrow shortcut built for vinegar and salt would eventually become the doorway for thousands of brand new, industrial chemicals nobody had ever tested. Somewhere between Ruth's pantry and the aisle her granddaughter shops in today, something quietly shifted. The meaning of generally recognized as safe stopped requiring anyone outside the company itself to actually recognize it at all. There was one ingredient, years later, that would send hundreds of Americans to the hospital. We'll come back to that. Decision 1. By the early 1970s, the FDA built a formal review process. Companies would petition the agency, submit their data, and wait for a government scientist to actually sign off. Consequence: the wait was brutal. By the agency's own account, some petitions sat unresolved for 6 years or more. Picture a loading dock somewhere in the Midwest, pallets of a brand new food ingredient already shrink-wrapped and ready to ship, while its safety paperwork sat untouched in a government inbox. Decision 2. By 1997, the FDA admitted defeat. The agency said plainly it could no longer devote substantial resources to personally affirming every new ingredient companies wanted to bring to market. Consequence? That's not a footnote in a regulation. That's the entire rulebook, changing shape. If you've ever wondered how a company gets to decide, on its own, that its own product is safe, this is the rule that made that possible. So the FDA proposed something different, a voluntary notification system. A company could still choose to tell the FDA about a new ingredient it had determined was safe. Or, just as legally, it could choose not to. 2 generations later, in a grocery aisle not far from where Ruth once shopped, her granddaughter stood reading a label she couldn't quite explain to her own daughter. Modified food starch, natural flavors. She wasn't uneducated. She was reading a label built from a regulatory system her grandmother's era never had reason to imagine. That gap between 1997 and 2016 isn't just bureaucratic history. It's the reason a label in your own hand today can list something no regulator has ever actually seen. The rule the FDA proposed in 1997 wasn't actually finalized until 2016, nearly 2 decades later. And when it finally became official, one core detail hadn't moved an inch. Notifying the government remained entirely optional. Harvard's Emily Broad-Leib, who directs the university's Food Law and Policy Clinic, has spent years studying exactly how far that gap reaches. By her account, thousands of substances have entered the American food supply through this single mechanism, many of them never reviewed by a single government scientist before landing on a store shelf. So here's the question this raises. If a company is legally allowed to decide its own ingredient is safe, hire its own experts, run its own studies, and never show that homework to anyone outside its own walls, what exactly stops that process from becoming precisely what it sounds like? A company grading its own test. And for nearly 30 years, almost nobody checking the answer key. By the numbers, this isn't a fringe concern. Research from the Pew Charitable Trusts found the FDA has never independently reviewed the safety of roughly 3,000 of the 10,000 chemical additives currently allowed in American food, and estimated that around 1,000 were self-affirmed as safe without ever notifying the agency. A separate analysis by the Environmental Working Group found that nearly 99% of new food chemicals introduced since the year 2000 entered the American market through this exact self-affirmed pathway, not FDA review. That statistic matters because it isn't the exception anymore. It's how almost every new ingredient reaches your kitchen table today, many of them with no public record at all. There is, to this day, no public database listing which ingredients were self-affirmed this way, and for some of them, the FDA likely doesn't even know their names, because telling the agency was never required in the first place. And that number isn't rare anymore, it's the default. There's a good chance something in your own pantry got there this same way. Ruth's pantry once held 24 ingredients she could name without thinking. Her granddaughter's kitchen now holds labels filled with names she can't fully explain to her own child, approved not by a regulator, but by the very companies profiting from selling them. This isn't hypothetical. Remember that ingredient we mentioned earlier? In 2022, an ingredient called Terra flour, self-affirmed as GRAS, no FDA review required, was linked to hundreds of Americans getting sick, 39 of them losing their gallbladder entirely. By 2024, after those illnesses, the FDA finally conducted its own independent review and concluded Terra flour never actually met the GRAS standard to begin with. It simply hadn't been stopped sooner, because under the current system, nothing requires it to be caught before people get hurt. That's the real turning point of this story. Not one dramatic headline, a quiet regulatory shift stretched out from 1997 to 2016 that let an entire category of American food chemicals reach your table with no independent check at all. And it stayed that way, largely unnoticed, for almost 30 years. So here's where that leaves you, right now, standing in your own kitchen. Today, ultra-processed foods make up an estimated 73% of the American food supply, a figure shaped by cheap ingredients, convenience, and decades of marketing. The story is finally starting to shift. In March of 2025, Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. directed the FDA to explore eliminating the self-affirmation pathway altogether, the same loophole that let Terra flour and thousands of other chemicals skip independent review entirely. Manufacturers, Kennedy said, had exploited a loophole, introducing new ingredients whose safety data often never reaches the public at all. As of now, that rule still hasn't been finalized. Industry groups argue the current system still works, that self-affirmation lets safe, well-understood ingredients reach the market faster, without unnecessary red tape. Food safety advocates counter that speed without a public paper trail isn't oversight. It's an honor system. A proposal is reportedly sitting for White House review, while both sides wait to see whether notifying the FDA finally becomes a requirement instead of a choice. Several states aren't waiting for Washington. California, Illinois, and a handful of others have already begun passing their own food chemical transparency laws, requiring companies to disclose more about what's going into their products, moving faster on transparency than Washington has so far. Depending on where you live, that change may already be reaching your own grocery shelf. In the same grocery aisle Ruth once shopped, her granddaughter still stands today, except the shelf in front of her now carries thousands of ingredients that didn't exist in Ruth's lifetime at all. Would you have assumed someone at the FDA reviewed every ingredient before it reached the shelf? So, why does America allow this? Not because of some grand conspiracy. For 68 years, the honest answer has been simpler, and somehow worse. Nobody outside the company itself was ever actually required to check. Not because one villain sat down and planned it that way, but because a stretched agency, a booming food industry, and one quiet rule change in 1997 all landed in the same place, decade after decade, without anyone stepping back to ask if it still made sense. Today, for the first time in a generation, that question is finally being asked out loud, by regulators, by state legislatures, by a health secretary willing to name the loophole publicly. Whether it actually closes for good is still being decided. Ruth's granddaughter is still in that same aisle, but this time, she isn't just reading the label alone. She's showing her own daughter how, passing down something Ruth's generation never had to teach at all. It's a small habit, but for most American families, it's the closest thing to oversight they've ever actually had. What you have control over, right now, is smaller than a law, but it's real. The story of what's actually in American food doesn't end at this shelf, though. It reaches all the way into how those same food companies shape school lunches, government guidelines, and dinner tables, far beyond the grocery aisle. If this changed how you see the food in your own kitchen, that's exactly what Health Evolution TV is here for. The story behind the things we take for granted.